My boyfriend's tantrums during our long-awaited vacation showed me the truth. I am in complete danger now. I remember when I first met him. I was newly 20 years old, and he was a striking presence the moment he walked into the dimly lit party at our mutual friend's apartment. He had this easy smile, a spark in his eye, and that confidence you think only comes from years of success or intense self-assurance. But there he was, at 20-something, commanding the room. One of those people who isn't necessarily the loudest or the most obvious alpha, but the moment you catch his eyes, you think, wow, who is this person? We introduced ourselves, me leaning shyly against the kitchen counter, half wishing I had a better conversation starter. But I remember him approaching with a plate of random hors d'oeuvres in hand, offering me one with a crooked grin. I smiled, took one, and thanked him. It was such a silly, small moment, but we fell into conversation so naturally, discussing our mutual friend, the random music playing from cheap speakers, and the city we both lived in. That night, after everyone left, we ended up talking for hours in my friend's living room. We discovered we had a lot in common: a love for traveling, a fascination with books that explore the human psyche, and a shared fondness for adopting rescue animals. I found myself confiding in him about my past heartbreak, something I never did with strangers. There was an ease about him that made me want to keep talking, keep listening. We started dating not long after. I was so drawn to his charisma, to the way he could make me laugh at the smallest things. He had a huge circle of friends, and I felt a tug of validation whenever he introduced me to them, proud to have me on his arm. Likewise, his family welcomed as though I was the last missing piece of a larger puzzle. They were, and still are, warm, close-knit, and they treated me like a daughter. But even early on, I noticed an undercurrent of tension in him, something that would flare up in small ways and then disappear just as quickly. Sometimes, he'd get super competitive when playing board games or sports with friends. I remember once, while playing a casual game of tennis, he lost a set and hurled the racket across the court in frustration. We laughed it off afterward, but a part of me felt uneasy. The anger in his eyes was real, if only for a moment. The more we dated, the more I saw these flashes of frustration, getting overly annoyed at traffic, slamming doors when his phone battery died, or fuming when a video game didn't go his way. It always felt like such trivial triggers. Back then, he'd apologize right afterward, telling me, "I'm sorry, I just get frustrated sometimes. I'm working on it." I believed him because he seemed genuine. He was sweet and thoughtful most of the time, a person I truly came to love. We moved in together a couple of years into our relationship, renting a small apartment in the city where the living room practically merged with the kitchen. Even though it was cramped, it felt like home. Some nights we'd sit on the couch, me curled up beside him, and I remember feeling so safe and content, lulled by the rumble of passing cars through open windows. He told me repeatedly how much he adored me, how he couldn't imagine a life without me. I would beam at him, my heart full. But inevitably, his anger problem remained in the background, bubbling up at unexpected intervals. Some weeks he'd be perfectly fine, the easygoing, funny man I adored. Then, at the slightest inconvenience, like forgetting to buy milk or getting the wrong brand of coffee filters, he'd slip into a tense silence or snap at me, making me feel like I'd committed an unforgivable sin. Each time we'd talk it through after he cooled down, he'd tell me he was trying to handle stress better, that he never meant to hurt me. He would promise improvement. He'd say, "I won't give you the silent treatment any. I love you too much to keep doing this." It always seemed so sincere. But it kept happening. Sometimes he'd rage at external factors, his job, his friends, or random strangers on the road, but I'd end up as the nearest emotional target. He'd freeze me out with his silence, making me question my own worth. Was I overreacting by feeling hurt? Could I be more supportive? I did everything in my power to placate him. I'd let him fume alone until he got it out of his system. Then I'd softly approach him with a gentle voice, offering solutions or asking how I could help. His typical reply was a cold shrug or a literal turning of his back. Those were the worst moments for me, feeling so dismissed, like my attempts at kindness were invalid. We made it work for nearly 6 years. People asked us all the time, "So when's the wedding?" Or "When are you two having kids?" And it felt natural to consider. We were woven into each other's families, had mutual friends, spent holidays together in a swirl of laughter and tradition. He was very thoughtful in calmer times, cooking my favorite meal on my birthday, surprising me with little gifts, or sending me sweet texts out of the blue. But the anger episodes never really went away. They'd simmer down for a while, then rear their head again. It chipped away at me bit by bit, eroding my confidence and sense of stability. I used to believe that love was enough, that if we tried hard enough, we could get through anything together. But I started feeling a creeping sense of dread whenever something went wrong in our day-to-day lives, not because of the problem itself, but because of how he would inevitably react. The turning point came during a group trip we had planned. We'd joined 2 other couples we're close with, venturing out of the country to explore a place none of us had been before. This was supposed to be a magical experience. New cultures, new foods, a chance to spend quality time together away from the routine of work and life responsibilities. I'd been looking forward to it for months. Day one of the trip was fairly smooth. We arrived at the hotel, a quaint spot near a bustling downtown, and I was practically buzzing with excitement. Sure, there were the usual travel annoyances, dealing with customs, lugging our suitcases, and figuring out local transportation. But we handled it. We were tired, but we settled into our room with minimal friction. I remember falling asleep that night to the hum of city nightlife outside, holding his hand, believing we'd have an amazing time the rest of the week. Day two was when the first little spark of tension showed itself. We went sightseeing in the morning, meandering through cobblestone streets with a small tour group. He seemed fine at first, snapping pictures, laughing at jokes with our friends. But then we got caught in an unexpected downpour. It was midday, the clouds rolled in, and we were drenched in seconds. I scrambled to get out an umbrella, but it was too small for both of us, and inevitably we got soaked. He started complaining about how, this is so typical. The weather forecast said it would be sunny, and now our day is ruined. He kept repeating how no one had bothered to check updated forecasts, how no one had come prepared. I tried to calm him down, pointing out that everyone was equally as surprised, and that we could just find a cafe to dry off. But he seethed, sulking and snapping that I should have brought a bigger umbrella. The rest of the group, though sympathetic at first, gradually drifted away from us, giving us space. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, trying my best to appease him while the sky opened up above us. Eventually, he stormed ahead, leaving me trotting after him down narrow streets, water puddling around my shoes. By the time we found a cafe, I was shivering, both from the cold and the stress. He gave me the silent treatment as we sat there, nursing 2 mugs of hot chocolate. I wanted to cry, but I forced a small smile, sipping quietly, hoping he'd cool off. He did, sort of. That night, we reunited with our friends for dinner, and he was pleasant again, making jokes, sharing stories. My chest ached with relief, though I was still shaken by the earlier episode. I put it aside, telling myself, this is just how he gets sometimes. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't wearing me down, but I managed to enjoy the meal. His sweet side re-emerged when he noticed I was quiet, and he reached for my hand under the table. I interlaced my fingers with his, grateful that the tension had dissolved so quickly. Day 3 is when I began to realize we had a serious problem. Another couple in our group suggested we go on a ferry to a nearby island with beautiful beaches and a renowned historic site. Everyone was excited for a relaxing day, and we hopped on the morning ferry full of energy. But halfway through, the sea got choppy, and one of our friends, Katie, got seasick. She looked pale and unsteady on her feet. Concerned, I spent a chunk of the ride trying to help her, fetching tissues, guiding her to a seat near the railing, finding water, and reassuring her it would pass. My boyfriend, on the other hand, kept glaring, like this entire scenario was a personal inconvenience to him. Every few minutes, he'd huff something like, "We're going to miss the best snorkeling spots," or "We should have taken a private charter." "This ferry is a joke," I kept telling him quietly to relax, that it wasn't anyone's fault. The silent stares I got in return made my heart sink. By the time we reached the island, Katie was feeling better, but my boyfriend was in an unspoken rage. He wouldn't talk to me, barely acknowledged our friends. The day might have recovered if he had let it go, but instead, he decided to wander off on his own without saying a word. I was left standing on the beach, scanning a crowd of tourists, trying to spot him. My stomach knotted with worry and confusion. When he finally showed up an hour later, he brushed past me and said, "Don't worry about it," the bitterness in his voice palpable. I knew it was another silent treatment episode. No clarity, no explanation. Just punishing me for not, what? For not focusing on him? For not making the seasickness magically disappear? For not persuading the ocean to be calm that day? We ended that night in near silence at dinner. Our group sensed the tension, but they mostly tried to give us space, talking among themselves about the day, the island's wonders. I felt so isolated, consumed by the anxiety that no matter what I did, I couldn't please him. That night, I cried quietly in the bathroom, biting my lip so he wouldn't hear. This trip was supposed to be a celebration of our many years together, not a reminder of all the underlying fractures. Day 4 dawned, and I dared to hope for a good day. He actually seemed in decent spirits. We joined our friends for an early morning hike to a renowned overlook. The climb was steep but manageable, with breathtaking views of the coastline from the top. The air was still cool, the horizon tinted with the reds and oranges of sunrise. For a moment, I felt revived. This was what we had saved, planned, what we had fantasized about from the confines of our daily routines back home. He wrapped an arm around my waist at the summit, pulling me in close for a picture with our friends. I felt the warmth of his body, smelled the familiar scent of his skin, and I thought, maybe this is the day we truly connect. Afterwards, we descended, found a local breakfast spot, and the morning was light, even joyful. Everyone chatted about what we wanted to do in the afternoon. Some suggested a guided food tour, others wanted to lounge on the local beach. Everything seemed calm. Then, in an instant, the mood shattered. We'd just finished breakfast, splitting the bill among us. My boyfriend realized he'd forgotten his wallet at the hotel, which was quite a distance away. Normally, one might just borrow from a friend and say, "Hey, I'll pay you back," right? It's not a big deal, especially among close friends. But he spiraled, turning red in the face with fury, muttering how irresponsible it was that I didn't remind him to bring his wallet, and how if I were more attentive, this would never have happened. I stood there in shock, fumbling to grab my own card to cover him. He took the money from me, but instead of a simple thank you, he cast me a look that made me feel tiny, worthless. The rest of the morning was overshadowed by his glowering silence and biting remarks whenever we tried to engage him. I reached a point where I felt physically ill, a constant knot in my stomach that made me barely able to sip water, let alone eat or enjoy the trip. My mind was racing, my chest tight. Later that evening, when we returned to the hotel, I begged him to talk to me, to explain what was truly bothering him. He sat on the edge of our bed, jaw clenched, arms crossed, refusing to look my way. It took every ounce of courage for me to keep my voice steady. I repeated, "Please, just tell me what you need. Tell me what I did wrong, or how we can fix this." He shrugged. Then he said something that felt like a dagger to the heart. "You're not helping me enough." My eyes welled up as I struggled to understand what exactly he wanted. How? I was trying to help. I was open to any feedback, any direction, any solution. But he gave me nothing but cold silence or short, scathing remarks. That night, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. We still had 2 days left of this trip and I felt trapped. I had to face him, sleep next to him, play nice in front of our friends, and pretend everything was okay. The idea of confronting him about a breakup in the middle of a group vacation felt impossible. I didn't want to sabotage everyone else's experience. The best I could do was hold it together until we got home. Day 5, predictably, was another roller coaster. In the morning, he was apologetic and sweet, leaning over me in bed, kissing my forehead, whispering he was sorry for his out. He said, "I know I get upset easily, but I promise it's not your fault. I love you. I'm just stressed out." My heart twisted. I wanted so badly to believe this was genuine progress, that maybe he'd turned a corner. But the day before was still fresh in my mind. I couldn't erase the memory of his fury, the pit in my stomach that had me awake half the night. We joined the others at a local market, an enchanting array of exotic spices, fresh fruits, handmade crafts, and vibrant fabrics. For a few hours, we had fun sampling local snacks and bartering with vendors. There were moments he looked at me with warmth, moments where his hand found mine. But every time I felt a surge of hope, I'd remind myself of how quickly he could snap. And sure enough, he had one last tantrum in him before we left. It was something minor. Someone in our group wanted to check out a particular vendor stall, and he got irritated that the group was splitting up. He made a snide comment like, "Nobody can stick to a plan for 5 minutes," then shoved his hands into his pockets, glaring at the ground. The friend in question simply ignored him, but I felt my anxiety spike again. I could sense him teetering on the edge of an outburst, so I kept quiet, letting him stew. Eventually, he walked off. By now, our friends were used to these episodes. They gave me sympathetic glances as I hurried after him. I found him standing near a bus stop, arms crossed, jaw tense, refusing to rejoin the group. He made me stay with him, just the two of us, as he lectured me on how everyone else was incompetent and nobody ever listens to him. I nodded, tears burning my eyes, swallowing the lump in my throat. After a while, he calmed down enough to follow me back to the market, but the damage was done. The rest of the day was overshadowed by tension. By that night, I felt hollow. The trip had become a nightmare for me. Constant stress, fear, and embarrassment. My appetite was gone, replaced with near-constant nausea from the tension. My hands shook a little as I packed my suitcase, anticipating the flight home the next day. That's when I started drafting the mental letter to him I never thought I would. "I can't do this anymore. I have to leave." It felt surreal, because I had invested nearly 6 years of my life into this relationship. I'd built a vision of our future, of marriage, children, building a home. But each little tantrum, each silent treatment, each episode of inexplicable rage had chipped away at me until I was no longer sure of anything, except that this was not sustainable. He'd promised so many times to improve, but there we were, in a foreign country, repeating the exact same pattern we'd gone through hundreds of times. On our final day, I tried my hardest to keep it together, for our friend's sake. I pasted on a polite smile, joined them in a quick brunch, and made small talk about the highlights of the trip. My boyfriend seemed in a better mood. He was cracking jokes, sipping coffee, wrapping an arm around me in front of the others. We looked like a happy couple to outside eyes, but inside, I felt only dread. My mind was miles away, rehearsing how I'd break it to him. I love you, but this is killing me. When we boarded the plane home, I remember sitting next to him, feeling the airplane vibrate beneath me as it took off. My head was spinning with the knowledge of what I had to do once we landed. He leaned his head against my shoulder at one point, drifting to sleep. I stared at the back of the seat in front of me, tears trickling silently down my cheeks. 6 years. So many memories, both beautiful and painful. I wanted to freeze time, avoid the heartbreak that awaited us. But I couldn't lie to myself any longer. We arrived back home late in the evening, exhausted from the journey. My parents' home was only about 30 minutes away from our apartment, and I had already decided I was going there right after we landed. When we walked into our apartment, I told him, voice trembling, that I needed to talk. He paused, saw the look on my face, and his features tightened. He must have known something big was coming. I sat on the edge of our couch, the same couch where we'd watched movies, snuggled, laughed. He stood in front of me, arms folded, eyes wary. And then I said it. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I couldn't do it anymore. That this trip had been the final straw. I explained how every time he got angry or gave me the silent treatment, a piece of me withered away. That despite loving him deeply, I couldn't marry or start a family with someone who abandoned me emotionally at every bump in the road. My voice cracked when I admitted I was terrified of losing him and terrified of a future where his anger kept me caged in anxiety. He looked stunned. For a moment, he was speechless. Then he broke down, tears sliding down his cheeks, and I saw all that bravado crumble. He sank onto the couch next to me, trying to take my hands in his. There was such genuine remorse on his face, it momentarily made me doubt myself. He pleaded with me, please give me another chance. I promise I'll change. I'll get help for my anger. I'll work on my communication. Just, please don't leave. I felt my heart shattering because I did love him. I loved the good parts of him, the gentle parts, the sense of humor, the way he'd light up when he talked about his passions. But I stayed firm. I told him I couldn't keep living in constant fear. He tried to argue that we could go to couples counseling, that we just needed better conflict resolution strategies. And while part of me longed to say yes, to cling to hope, I couldn't ignore the repeated pattern. He'd promised so many times that he would change. We'd had countless talks, and for a while, things would improve, but it never lasted. I told him, I don't want to spend the rest of my life with the man you are today. I want to spend it with the man you have the potential to be, but I can't wait around for that man to show up anymore. Not if it means sacrificing my own peace. He began sobbing, burying his face in his hands. I saw, in that moment, a raw vulnerability in him, like a little boy who never learned how to handle life's frustrations without lashing out. My own tears started flowing freely. 6 years. So many memories. I thought of holiday gatherings with his family, lazy Sunday mornings in bed, the text messages he sent me every day at noon just to say he loved, but I also remembered the fear. The feeling of walking on eggshells. The constant second-guessing if something I said or did might spark his anger. The humiliating moments on that trip when his outbursts cast a dark cloud over everything. The tears. The near-constant apologies. I had reached my limit. So, with my voice shaking, I told him I needed time and space, that I was going to stay with my parents. I wasn't going to argue or be talked out of it. I'd already packed a small bag, anticipating this conversation. He started to panic, asking, "Why are you doing this now? We just got home." But I tried to make him see that we'd never have a perfect time for such a discussion. I had to do it, or risk backing out in a moment of weakness. He grabbed my hand, tears flooding his eyes, telling me I was everything to him. I wanted to melt into his arms and tell him I'd stay. But the memory of his silent treatment, the way he pinned all blame on me or others, the endless apologies that never stuck, that kept me resolute. I gently untangled my fingers from his and stood up. "I can't trust your words anymore," I said softly. "You say you'll change, but for 6 years, you haven't. I can't risk my heart on another empty promise." He didn't try to stop me when I picked up my bag, but I saw the devastation in his face. It was gut-wrenching. I left the apartment we had shared, tears streamed, feeling like I was ripping a piece of my soul apart. My parents welcomed me with open arms, sensing the depth of my heartbreak without pressing for too many details. I collapsed in my old bedroom, sobbing into the pillow I'd slept on as a child, feeling at once safe and inconsolably lost. The next few days were a blur. He called and texted me several times a day, apologizing, begging me to come back. He was gentle, even during his pleas, insisting he would go to therapy, that he'd do anything to show me he was serious this time. I cried after reading each message, but I refused to respond with a promise I couldn't keep. I needed him to understand that this wasn't a game or an empty threat. It was a real boundary. Meanwhile, the sense of relief at not having to walk on eggshells was startling. As heartbroken as I was, a weight lifted off that anxious pit in my stomach. I realized it wasn't there for the first time in ages. I even ate a full meal without feeling the urge to vomit. I felt guilty for feeling that sense of calm, but I knew it was a sign I'd made the right choice. I took a few days off from work to collect myself emotionally. I spent time taking long walks with our dog, who I had brought with, just breathing in the fresh air and letting the dog run around my parents' backyard. The dog seemed happier too, bounding around in the sunshine, not subjected to the tension that so often permeated our apartment. When I finally answered one of his calls, he was both desperate and contrite. He told me he had scheduled an appointment with a therapist who specialized in anger management and that he was willing to do counseling on his own, not just with me. In his voice, I could hear a determination that I hadn't heard before. It tugged at my heart. He asked me if there was any hope for us. I didn't lie. I told him that I didn't want to slam the door forever, but I couldn't be with him as he currently was. I needed a solid demonstration of real change, not just words. He said he understood. He was devastated, but he accepted it. That phone call ended with both of us crying, me sitting on the floor of my old bedroom, him likely in our apartment living room surrounded by the ghosts of our shared life. In the weeks that followed, we stayed in touch sporadically. He began seeing the therapist, from what I could tell. He moved out of our apartment and in with a friend so I could return to collect my things and sort out the lease situation without too much turmoil. He told me he wanted to give me space, and that stung and comforted me at the same time. Knowing he was capable of that small act of respect was more than I'd hoped for. Yet every time I thought of him, a pang of loss resonated deep in my chest. My parents were supportive, yet cautious. They reminded me that it was okay to hurt, okay to cry, okay to feel an entire swirl of emotions about the man I'd thought I would marry. My mom told me, one evening as we made dinner together, love alone can't fix someone. They have to want to fix themselves. I spoke to a few close friends too, including the ones who had been on that disastrous trip. They said they weren't surprised by my decision, but they were proud of me for taking the step. Some of them told me they'd seen the cracks in our relationship for a long time, how he never seemed to handle life's small irritations without blowing up, how I always seemed to scurry after him to smooth things over. But they never wanted to interfere or upset me by pointing it out. Looking back, it's hard to pinpoint when I started walking on eggshells. Maybe it was subtle at first, changing my plans so he wouldn't get annoyed, making sure I did everything I could to prevent him from encountering the slightest frustration. Over time, it became second nature. I'd watch his mood like a hawk, detect the faintest sign of irritation, and modify my behavior or my words to appease him. I had become so conditioned to keep the peace that I'd lost sight of my own voice. Now, standing at this crossroads, I feel both terror and relief. Terror, because I've spent so many years identifying as half of a couple, building a life around this person, knowing his favorite meals, his inside jokes, his grand ambitions. Relief, because I no longer have to tiptoe around the unpredictability of his anger. I can wake up in the morning and not worry about how the day will go. My mind is no longer in a constant state of fight or flight. That's not to say it's easy. It's excruciatingly painful to walk away from someone you love, someone you've shared so many memories with. Every once in a while, I catch myself reminiscing about our better moments. The day we took an impromptu road trip to a lake, just the two of us, laughing the whole way. Or the way he surprised me with a homemade birthday cake one, even though it turned out lopsided because he didn't measure the ingredients properly. There was genuine love there, and I still believe he isn't a bad person at heart. He just hasn't learned to deal with his emotions in a healthy way. Maybe it was his upbringing. From what I know, his parents are rather volatile with each other, quick to yell and never truly apologizing after, and he grew up in that environment. But as much as I empathize, I cannot sacrifice myself on the altar of someone else's trauma. I've come to accept that if a person is not actively working to address their issues, those issues will keep harming everyone around them. Days turned into weeks and I stayed at my parents' house. Every day I got a bit stronger. I started rejoining social events, meeting up with old friends I hadn't seen in a while. I went hiking by myself, feeling the sun on my face, breathing in fresh air, and letting the tension seep out of me step by step. I spontaneously agreed to a weekend trip with my cousin to visit relatives in another city, something I would have hesitated to do before because it might have upset him if the timing wasn't perfect or if he thought I was being inconsiderate of his schedule. That's when I noticed how often I used to check with him before making even the simplest decisions. I would check if he was in a good mood or if he had any complaints. I realized how draining it had been. There's an exhilaration in knowing I can just say yes or no on my own terms now. We finally arranged a day for him to come get the rest of his belongings from our apartment. I offered to meet him there, but he said he'd rather do it alone. Perhaps he didn't want the emotional weight of me watching him pack. I understood. I felt tears well up as I pictured him gathering up his clothes, his sports gear, little souvenirs from our travels, the photos of us he used to frame on his desk. All those shared memories packed away into boxes. It was like a funeral for the relationship. When I went by the next day, the place felt so empty. Some of the furniture was gone, the pictures missing from the walls, and the entire space felt foreign despite all the years we'd lived there. I sank onto the bare mattress. He had taken the bed frame and just breathed, letting the wave of nostalgia wash over me. This was a place that had once been filled with laughter, cooking experiments, random dance parties, Netflix binges, holiday decorations. But it had also been the stage for countless arguments, silent treatments, slammed doors, tearful apologies. I sat there until the sun began to set, letting myself mourn. Now, as I write this, I'm in a better place mentally. I'm still living at my parents' for the time being while sorting out finances and deciding what my next step will be, finding my own apartment, or maybe looking for a roommate. It's scary, building a new life from scratch, but it's also liberating. I've kept in touch with him sporadically. He told me he's continuing therapy and even exploring a men's emotional support group recommended by his counselor. He says he's delving into understanding how to handle anger in healthier ways. I can hear in his voice that he's serious about this. He's not rushing to find quick fixes, but actually talking about the root causes, his childhood, the patterns. He told me, I don't want to be this person anymore. I want to treat everyone better, including myself. I believe him in the sense that I think he's genuinely trying. But I've also learned that change is a gradual process, and I can't pin my entire future on the possibility that he'll transform overnight. If he truly wants to become a healthier, more stable person, that has to be his journey, separate from me. I'm not his mother or his therapist. I'm someone who deserves to be cherished, not subjected to the brunt of his frustration. Sometimes he'll ask if I can ever see us reconciling. My honest answer is that I don't know. I'll never say never because I do love him, and I'll probably always care about him. But I have to see real evidence of consistent, lasting change. Months or even years of him genuinely handling conflict differently, maturing emotionally, and taking responsibility instead of shifting blame. That's a high bar, but it's the only bar that makes sense for my well-being. In the meantime, I'm focusing on rediscovering the woman I was before I learned to tiptoe around another person's temper. I'm reconnecting with my hobbies: painting, creative writing, yoga, and reading. I signed up for a pottery class with a friend, something I used to talk about doing but never felt I had the time or emotional energy. It feels good, getting my hands messy with clay, letting my creativity flow without reservation. I also started therapy on my own, just a few sessions to help me process the emotional trauma of those 6 years. My therapist is compassionate and insightful. She's helping me unlearn the reflex to appease. She's encouraging me to build boundaries with everyone in my life, not just romantic partners, to ensure I don't slip back into unhealthy dynamics. Some days, I miss him fiercely. I'll see a funny meme and think, he'd love this. Or I'll hear a song we used to belt out together, and it hits me hard. I'll let myself cry, let the emotions flow, and then remind myself why I chose this path. Because in love, you need to feel safe. You need to feel respected, heard, valued. You need open communication, not punishment or manipulation, intended or not. You need a partner who shares the load of life's stresses instead of blaming you for them. That's the logical conclusion of our story at this point. I left him. I had to, for the sake of my own well-being. It was, and continues to be, excruciating, but it was also necessary. He's now on a journey of self-improvement, of therapy, and introspection, and I genuinely hope he emerges from this a stronger, kinder version of himself, whether we ever reunite or not. And for me, I'm learning to breathe freely again. I'm finding joy in the simple fact that I no longer have to walk on eggshells around someone's unpredictable anger. I'm rediscovering the version of me who is spontaneous, loves adventure, and doesn't think twice about saying yes to last-minute plans. I'm rebuilding relationships I'd unintentionally neglected, and it feels like stepping out of a dark, cramped room into the wide-open sunshine. So, yes, it's heartbreaking. Yes, it's terrifying to think of starting over after almost 6 years. Yes, I still feel pangs of fear when I think of the future. But for the first time in a long while, I can picture a path forward that isn't overshadowed by dread or anxiety. I don't regret loving him. I don't regret the years we spent together. But I don't regret leaving either. Sometimes the person we love is exactly the person we need to leave behind to save ourselves, and sometimes that act can even be the catalyst for them to grow. There's a strange hope in that reality, a bittersweet truth. I'm not sure what life holds for me now. I just know I'm not the same frightened partner constantly trying to placate someone's anger. I'm reclaiming my voice. I'm reclaiming me. And that, ultimately, is all I can do. In the months following the breakup, I saw genuine effort from him to change. He continued therapy, joined an anger management group, and attended workshops that focused on healthier communication strategies. He'd occasionally share what he was learning, reflecting on how he'd modeled his behavior after his parents' toxic marriage. He confessed he'd never realized how deeply rooted those habits were. We remained in distant contact, both of us focusing on our separate healing. I watched him navigate his own triggers more calmly, and he apologized to old friends he'd slighted or lashed out at. He even rebuilt some bridges with family members who had distanced themselves from his temper. Witnessing it from afar, I felt a cautious pride. As for me, I found a cozy little studio apartment in the city, not too far from my parents, yet far enough to have my own space. I decorated it with bright tapestries, filled the bookshelves with my favorite novels, and placed a small table by the window where I could drink tea in the mornings. I made it mine, a place free of tension and fear, a home that reflected my newfound independence. Yes, sometimes I'd scroll through old photos of him and me, the corners of my heart aching at the memories. But I pressed on, continuing my own therapy, nurturing my hobbies, reconnecting with family and friends. I said yes to spontaneous road trips, tried new restaurants, and gradually expanded my world beyond the confines of that old dynamic. If our paths crossed, it was cordial, sometimes filled with tears, sometimes with a faint trace of warmth. He told me once softly, "I'm sorry I couldn't change fast enough." I told him I was sorry too, that things had to end so painfully. But we both acknowledged it had been necessary for our individual growth. In the end, that's the bittersweet truth of it all. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. And in that letting go, both people can find the space to become who they're truly meant to be, free of the toxic patterns that once held them captive. I don't know if our future paths will ever reunite in a romantic sense, but I do know that I'm stronger now, more in tune with my worth, and unafraid to enforce my boundaries. For that alone, I'm grateful, and I remain hopeful for whatever comes next.